But let's move on to where you really wanted to go, which was New Orleans. And I can totally understand that. You say here that Nora Ephron tells you that New Orleans is not America when you say you want to move there because you're enchanted by it. And I think you also quote Tennessee Williams, who said, America only has 3 cities, San Francisco, New York, and New Orleans. And I wonder if it might actually be only New Orleans.
Yes,
so here's a place
that is my theory, yes.
Yeah, but it's both described as not America and the only American city. So how do you reconcile that? And again, you find this happening across the 10 everywhere.
So that conversation with Nora was basically around her horror that I was leaving New York City, her being, of course, the consummate New Yorker, sort of the patron saint.
The city for so many people.
One of the many patron saints of New York. And she said, you're leaving New York, you'll have to move back to America. And I said, well, actually, I'm moving to New Orleans. And she said, yes, that is not America. Right. You will get very fat and you will be very happy. And I was like, A, sign me up, and B, sound, great. When do I punch in? I think the conversation about is New Orleans even America or is it the best American city is actually a conversation that I think is in some ways about American exceptionalism. I've been asked quite a lot during this press tour, do I believe in American exceptionalism? And I have a very obnoxious answer, which is yes, but that depends on what we mean by exceptional. I would like to complicate or get curious about what we mean by exceptional. What is it about us that makes us exceptional? Is it a bunch of white men who don't want to pay their taxes and think black men only count as a quarter of a human being? Literally not in my book. I think what makes us exceptional is the basically everything that comes out of New Orleans. I think New Orleans, to me, is the definition of what makes America exceptional, which is that we can take grains of sand and turn them into a pearl. That I would rather we not have the North Atlantic slave trade. I would happily sacrifice jazz and blues and rock and roll to not have the North Atlantic slave trade. But since we did have the North Atlantic slave trade, I am mystified and deeply grateful for the fact that the first American art form was born out of that, which is the blues. And without the blues is how we get jazz, and how we get jazz is how we have rock and roll, and all of the sort of cultural outpourings that once again, Black Americans have turned immense pain and suffering into the American culture that the world imports and makes part of their own. So I think, is New Orleans even American? No. Is it the best America has? Absolutely. They are antipodal ideas, and yet I hold them concurrently.
At the same time, and you discussed this as well, and this is, I did my studies on New Orleans and its fragility and lived there and saw it every day. It continues to subside, and we have a whole podcast on that. It continues to lose its surrounding landscape, which threatens it even further. And to go to New Orleans every time I do, usually a couple times a year, it's in a further state of decay over here, but something new is happening here. And the changeability of that place is something that I think is exceptional, but it wouldn't be the city that many would reference when talking about American exceptionalism, except for that ability to reinvent itself while still somehow maintaining its essence. It's a really complicated place.
It's an extremely complicated place. In the book, I say something along the lines of, if you need businesses to be open when their website or their Google search results say that it's open, if that's what you need, you should move to Cincinnati. This is not the place for you. I think it's really easy when you're talking about New Orleans to write horribly. I mean, you kind of accidentally fall into musical metaphors. But if the lovely 10X audience will bear with me for some out loud first draft thinking, I think when we're talking about New Orleans, something that I find innately American is the fact that it's an improvised city. And that's why you see here it's falling apart, whereas here they're kind of figuring something out. And in New Orleans, it could be a difference of 3 months where that switches suddenly. And then there's a whole other part, the folks up by Lake Pontchartrain are doing something else. They're doing something else with the wetlands, or, it's just like everything is kind of happening at once. It's like a bird song where it sounds cacophonous and atonal and anti-melodic. And yet it's all kind of coming together to create not something I would ever describe as harmonious, but of a kind. And I think if you can make that level of occasionally benevolent chaos work for you, then New Orleans will work for you.
I think that's right.
If that doesn't gel with you, it is not the time or place for you.
I think that's right. And we were talking about Phoenix earlier, and I would describe it as a manufactured city or an invented city in a place where a city of the scale we have become really doesn't belong. But New Orleans was the inevitable city. There had to be a great city at the mouth of the Mississippi River for defense purposes, economic purposes. You could control the whole interior of the North American continent if you had a city there. But it's a terrible place to build a city. It's not meant for it. And so it's got this duality at all times. It had to be there, should be there, but also shouldn't
it should
there.
Not be there. Yeah. And it's American, but it's also French. And it's French, but it's actually all the things we call French architecture built by Spaniards. Like it is, when we talk about the masking Mardi Gras Indians, New Orleans wears mask upon mask upon mask upon mask. And one of the things that I was really thrilled to stumble onto is my former college roommate. Their name is E. Gross, and they're a professor of at Tulane, and they gave me a zine that they had picked up, and it was called Bulbancha, and it was about the indigenous communities that lived around what is now New Orleans, and had sort of their metropolis was named Bulbancha. And it became this melting pot within a melting pot of indigenous peoples and Spanish peoples and French peoples and enslaved Africans and unenslaved Black Americans and the Creole community, which is an X factor that we haven't even, I unfortunately did not really have time to get into all of the nuances of Creole identity, which is fascinating because now we have a Creole Pope, which is incredible. So this idea that, and there's a filmmaker that named Zach Morris, who I interview in the book, and for him, Bulbancha is the prevalent metaphor of New Orleans, which is this is a swamp jungle that will kill you the moment it can. The ground isn't even ground. There's so how do you survive in this place? You have to depend on each other in these chaotic and complicated systems of ownership and artistry and economics and physical landscape. That means that we are all interdependent because this has to be here, but it can't be here. And that's a tension that I'm fascinated by. New Orleans is the only city in the book that gets more than one chapter. Because I just had way too much to say about it.
But let's back up on the highway, because what we're talking about in New Orleans is this fluidity. We're all in it together. We got to think about it that way. One could say the same about El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. We're all in it together, except there's a very clear demarcation between the two, but it's one metropolis, but with two very distinct identities that also merge to some extent, but you know exactly where that edge is. And you were in Ciudad Juarez, so you had someone who took you there, and so I think had a good understanding through the eyes of someone else who knows it better than either you or I have been there as well.
Yes.
Talk about that place, which has multiple identities, and what it told you about America.
El Paso was one of the cities that in 1996, when my mom and I did the original road trip, that I actually remember quite a lot of, because we spent my uncle at the time lived there, and that was the first time that I had met my uncle, one of my mother's three brothers. And so we paused there for a moment, and I have recollections of it from when I was 14. Coming back in 2019, the thing that came to mind as an outsider was my recollection of being in Budapest, which I had no idea until I got there that Budapest is two cities, Buda and Pest, divided by a river. And they, over the centuries, have kind of owned their amalgamation as sort of one metropolis, when it is actually two separate municipalities with their own cultures and histories. El Paso and its bifurcated twin, Ciudad Juarez, on the other side of the border, to me was a delicious, beautiful, and tragic place, because it's divorced from itself. And there was no conversation I had with anyone who had lived in El Paso for any amount of time that did not say to me at some point in our conversation, you really cannot understand El Paso without Ciudad Juarez. And I heard so many stories from people of all ages of the time when they would just pop over the border for dinner. Actually, Ciudad Juarez had a ballet, they had an opera, they had a symphony. So if you lived in El Paso and you wanted to partake in that level of culture, you had to cross the border, because that was not in the American city. It was in the Mexican city. And that was so counterintuitive to my ignorant assumptions of what that dynamic between the two cities was. It was really inverted. And so when I had the opportunity to go into Juarez with kind of like a fixer, George Slom, a really wonderful kind of know everybody figure in El Paso. It was kind of like meeting the Ferris Bueller of El Paso. It's like, this guy's got everything connected and he's got all the keys on a key ring to prove it. I really could not say no, because how often do you get offered to be walked into the quote unquote murder capital of the world? And as I portray in the book, it was a very violent weekend that I happened to be there, which was Easter weekend of 2019. The experience of being in El Paso and getting to talk to people was like hearing people talked about losing a loved one, that there was that there's an empty chair at the dining room table every night. And that El Pasoans, who before that summer was named the safest city in America, I don't know how many times running, partnered with the quote unquote murder capital of the world through its drug violence and its femicides and the constant slaughter and erasure of women in that city, that this was a deep tragedy, not only for the city, but in the lived existence of its citizens. And that there was no talking about life there that didn't acknowledge that something is wrong here. Not because there's a border and that we shouldn't have borders, but that the border was this like thumb in the dam hodgepodge approach to policing a landscape that, again, much like the built landscape of Phoenix, ran counterintuitive to lived reality, which is that there are families that exist on both sides of this, and that while it's not quite the East German, West German divide, that it felt antagonistic to the human dignity of people who live a border existence. And I did not understand the role that border life plays. It's its own sort of life.
Yes.
It's as specific as being from Maine and considering everyone who's not from Maine to be from away, or being Alaskan and considering everybody else who's not Alaskan as being from the lower states, right? Yeah. If you are not from the border, you do not understand border life, and you cannot really conceive of how ramshackle the approach to what should a border be is. So it was wildly educational, my time in El Paso and Juarez.
And so of the 4 things that you wanted to look at in the book that you really want to write, immigration was one of those. Yes. Infrastructure, climate change, voter suppression, whatever it might be. And unfortunately, many of the 10 across cities, this one in particular for a certain reason, represent caricatures of things like immigration. So when immigration is overheating and suddenly people are moving up from the South, as they will continue to do, and this problem is going to be further exacerbated by climate change, photographs or news reports from El Paso will show the border, literally the border, with razor wire now being assembled there. And it's a picture of a border that comports with an idea, oh yeah, the border really is fraught and difficult. Yeah. But it doesn't capture the safest city in the world, in the country, next to one of the most dangerous cities, and the reality of people crossing every single day to live their lives. So that's what struck us and caused 10 Across to come into existence. The discrepancy between our impressions of a place and the reality of being there, which is true, especially there. Let me ask you a few more things, and my producer Shirley saying, yes, this is clearly a double episode because we're going long, and we'll figure out how to make that work in production.
Of course.
But you are trying to sort things out with regard to your history and your mother, and somehow that seems to take you to places of difficulty. You go to Montgomery and look at the monuments there to lynching and other things. You talk about how tribes were treated in the Southwest and how they suffered. And by the way, bring us back to New Orleans, Mayor Landrieu was on our podcast, and I was well aware and thoroughly impressed with his removal of statues in New Orleans.
One of the great American speeches of the last century.
Absolutely. Yeah. Statues really dedicated to the lost cause. And you also visited places, including where Jefferson Davis lived, along the South. What attracted you to these places where clearly suffering was needing to be better understood? And how did that impact the way... There's not a one-to-one correspondence here between you and negotiations with your mother, but you seem to go to difficult locations and wanted to take those in.
Well, I think, the personal mystery that enabled me to go on this trip, which we've been kind of talking around, is that I discovered this journal of my mother's in which she described witnessing her father, who she never, ever discussed. She witnessed him commit a horrible, I would say, nightmarish crime, a crime that could be described as podcast worthy, honestly.
And I think it's good to leave it at that and let the readers get deeper into it.
And so, I was left with a series of questions because my mom's mental health meant that she had a flexible relationship with reality. And actual events. And so there was this question of, I think of myself as this consummate Californian, and I have always thought of the sort of grand question as, am I from Northern California or am I from Southern California? Where am I getting my water from, as it were? Which landscape is growing me? And the discovery of this horrible crime and my theories around what happened in my mother's childhood really prompted me to ask, what if the culture that I'm actually was raised in was not Western at all, but was a Southern culture of what it means to be a woman, of what the relationships between men and women are, what are the duties between family members? Do we talk about it? Do we not talk about it? And I realized that I only had the cliched sort of I had this sort of ersatz version of Southern culture in my life, and I wanted to interrogate the lessons that my mother gave me and kind of dismantle them to see, are these Western is this a Western lesson? Is this a Southern lesson? Are those even real? Are they in dialogue with each other? So there's that, this idea of, I think I have to wrap my head around Southernness and to see if this is what my mom, is that the blueprint my mother was working from? So that's from my mother's side. My father is a student of history, not in an academic sense, but in that he is also a huge nerd like myself. And he is involved with a project called the, oh God, Elizabeth, don't forget it now. I believe it's called the Who We Are Project. We'll get that in the show notes.
Okay.
And it's basically, my father read an article about the Tulsa Massacre and had never heard of it. And this is a man who is generally understood as to be America's dad. And,
and we should say here, in case this is now in part 2 of this podcast, and you didn't hear part 1, Elizabeth's father is the actor Tom Hanks, and thus knowing that he's interested in history will be of no surprise to anyone. It's kind of his thing,
right? He's like the boomer dad who loves World War II. His realization that the reason he did not know about the Tulsa Massacre is purely because he was white, because Black families across the street in Oakland, where he grew up, had of course heard of the Tulsa Massacre. And so he had this very late in the game realization of, my concept of American history is informed by whiteness. And I am not so fragile as to not be curious about what are the ramifications of that. And so my dad and I have been having these conversations about what is our relationship to American history and what would happen if we thought about American history as a series of dispassionate facts. And I think that the 10 is a series of dispassionate facts. It's not that I went looking for landscapes of murder, enslavement, rape, and disposition. That is the American landscape. And that is the landscape that the 10, through going through the Southwest and Texas and the Deep South, kind of just keeps bumping into these historical landmark experiences that define us in a way that I don't think any other landscape does. The joke that I make in the book is that kids grow up playing cowboys and Indians. We do not grow up playing New England maple farmers versus the trees. These landscapes are cooked into the American identity.
And I think what we would say to complement that is what we've experienced along the 10 is everything to some degree in its most extreme. Yes. Meaning the challenges of history.
The highs are highs and the lows are lows.
Exactly. And so it presents a different kind of American history. By the way, I think it's worth saying, one that is being challenged by the current administration that would like people, as they go to national parks and see things that maybe are a little disturbing, but that is our history. Yeah. Could that be rewritten in a more friendly way, a more accommodating way that causes us not to have to deal with some difficulties that happened in this region? New Orleans was the home of the slave trade in a big way.
They want history the same way that they want to bowl, but they want to bowl. They want a bumper bowl. They want history that comes with bumpers, so that you never roll a gutter, that you never have to think, I think we fell short there. And if you cannot handle, or if your emotional nervous system cannot withstand that maybe we got the North Atlantic slave trade wrong, I think you've got bigger issues than a plaque. That is my perspective. So it's not that I went looking for these places. It's that I was not afraid to keep my eye on these places. Yeah. The only place that I chose to go, that I went looking for pain, and as always happens, from the comment section to museums, the rule is if you go looking for pain, you will find it. The only place that I went looking for difficult history was after my experience at Beauvoir, which is the presidential home and library of Jefferson Davis, I thought I was making a responsible decision to go see a historical landmark placed in a responsible historical context. And that is not what Beauvoir is. To the tune of taxpayers' dollars, by the way.
Yes.
I think maybe my favorite bit of research that I found was an article that was published by Smithsonian that went into, and it was, believe the title of the article is "The Cost of the Confederacy," and it's all about how many taxpayer dollars go into maintaining essentially hate sites that do not place the Civil War and its reasons and its outcome as a series of dispassionate facts. Yeah. So what I saw at Beauvoir sent me off the 10. And yes, I went to the Equal Justice Initiative's National Monument for the Lynched. And I think every American should go to Montgomery, Alabama, and I think every American should go to the EJI.
And when you say what you said pretty starkly, which I appreciate, what's happening at Beauvoir is a suggestion, yes, there was this thing, slavery, and that was not necessarily a good thing, but the issue really was states' rights. And that's what the Civil War was all about, also known as the lost cause. Yeah. And the complexity of the South is wrapped up in those kinds of dualities and the perception of the place. And so I think the fact that you went there and wanting to understand these places seemed to coincide with other kinds of understandings you were trying to come to in your own personal history. So again, my producer is going to say, are you ever going to end this interview? And I don't really want
We've only gotten to New Orleans.
I know.
How do we unpack Florida? I mean, my God.
We're on our way to Florida. We're on our way to Florida. But I would just say, you said at the very beginning of this, well, what else are you going to add to your book, Elizabeth? Race? And in fact, you have, and you talk about it as we do in our podcast. Catherine Coleman Flowers, where she lives, is trying to help people, mostly African American, living in wildly under-resourced areas, have conventional plumbing in the 21st century. We've had interviews with people in California, Andrea Vidure, talking about why is my community, maybe it's the Hispanic community, maybe others, the ones who have to breathe in all the fumes from the trucks that are on the 10 going to the warehouses. So these historical monuments you visited still resonate today, or the residue from our history is still very present. But let's get back to the physical impression of the 10. And I was just mentioning
I was just going to say, the 10 itself is a monument to this complicated history that we're talking about, because the 10 is a perfect example of how the interstate system and the use of eminent domain. It's polite to say that it was disproportionately affected communities of color.
Oh, yes.
And so that's a different podcast.
It's a different podcast, and I think we need to line all these up. That would be our discussion with Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, who would tell you, in Houston, there's so much to Houston, where the 10 was placed wasn't done by accident. That caused a certain group of people not be adjacent to downtown where the economy was building up. You're over here in the 5th Ward, and that's not by accident that the monument of the 10 was placed where it was. But the 10 you mentioned was filled with trucks. It is a place of great commerce coming out of LA, your city. There are now autonomous trucks on the 10. Being making deliveries to enormous warehouses. Just your experience of moving across the 10 and the vitality of the country that you see being on it, and also the negative byproducts of that.
One of the most interesting interviews that I had was with a representative of the I can tell that I'm getting at the bottom of my caffeine when all of the names of all of the people and the organizations that they work for and volunteer for are all vanishing. We had a conversation about how they were spending billions of dollars just to fix the 10 in El Paso alone. The 10 is the only all-weather trans-continental interstate, meaning that every other highway that goes from coast to coast has to deal with winter, has to deal with snow. And so the vast amount of freight and heavy trucking is happening on the 10, and it is crumbling underneath the weight of our Amazon deliveries. Every box of kitty litter that gets put on a truck rather than in the back of your car is diminishing our ability to traverse our American cities because the technology of cement and road building has not altered so significantly that that it's evident in the backwoods of Louisiana.
That hasn't changed, but the technology that drives the trucks, meaning the fuel,
Yes,
and
that
also the
has-
technology that
yes.
steers them, is way out here. But for the reasons you
we
just
essentially
mentioned,
have Jetson trucks driving Flintstone roads.
both of which find the 10 to be the perfect place to be because of the lack of weather.
Right.
A lot of it is extremely flat. And so if you were going to create a laboratory for the future of transportation and commerce, you probably couldn't do much better than the 10.
Except for all that water,
Well-
and then except for all that lack of water.
Well, okay, sure.
Right.
Sure.
So
I'm more
has no, I hear what you're saying in that there's no winter, right?
Yeah, right.
But the changing climate landscape means that the 10 is not is not all weather, right?
Oh,
because
we have great photographs of as that were taken by people outside of Houston when various hurricanes have come through. The 10 is covered, and as we learn from people in Baton Rouge, which you sort of skim through, because I think somebody in your book says the best thing about Baton Rouge is New Orleans.
New Orleans.
But
My apologies to Baton Rouge. I had a delightful lunch there. I only had so many pages. I'm sorry.
And there's a great Atlantic article that is reprinted frequently. It said, I've seen the future. This is from someone in New Orleans, and it's Houston, suggesting that isn't good. But people have looked at the 10 from the Baton Rouge point of view and elsewhere that we know and say it's resembling the new coastline because the water is moving up here, and this is a divider, and people are looking at it that way.
One of my very first job as a 16-year-old, outside of working at bookstores where I really just hid in the back room and read, I Capture the Castle for the billionth time. My first job was working for Perry Communications Group, which was a public relations firm in Sacramento. And I worked on a campaign that was done for the truckers lobby group. I can't remember, United Wonderful Truck Drivers or something like that. And my job was copying all of these talking points and data points about trucking accidents and how often they were not the fault of the truck driver. It was the fault of people speeding around, essentially a stegosaurus that did not have a very quick braking time, or can't exactly swerve out of the way of something. And it was just all of these like horrendous numbers of damage and life lost to trucks and the way people drive around them. And I was on the road for a little under, I was around on the road, 8 months. And every accident I saw involved a semi-truck, and almost always involved what I call in the book fancy trucks, which are, dual cab, extended bed, dually engine. And as I now say, all truck, no cattle. Those, bro trucks, the kind of
you're now talking about pickup trucks. You're not talking about semi-tractor trucks. Yes.
The vast majority, all accidents that I saw involved a semi-truck, and the vast majority of them involved a pickup truck and a semi-truck. Just two bros duking it out, and one of them losing every time. When we're talking about the actual drive on the road, there were times where the 10 looked like a third world pitted, collapsing road that was literally crumbling like dry cake underneath my wheels. I've only seen roads like that in in places where I could only communicate by gesture, right? And let's acknowledge that this hierarchy, first world, second world, third world, wildly problematic. I'm just using it as a sort of placeholder when we're talking about the advancement of built landscapes. So sometimes the 10 is literally crumbling underneath my wheels. And sometimes, like the Big I, which is where it terminates in Jacksonville, it's this Death Star construction that has, how many floors and how big is this thing? How many on-ramps, how many off-ramps? This thing can swell into a juggernaut of engineering that, a bit like Phoenix, I can only look at and go, well, how long is that going to last?
That is so interesting that you would say it. That's what I was going to bring us to in the conclusion of our road trip across the 10 to Jacksonville and your comments about it. But before I do, I want to remind our listeners, you really need to read this book, The 10, and or listen to
you can have you have a sense of how much is in it. A lot.
Exactly. And or even better, listen to it, because it's Elizabeth narrating the book and reading, and you get a sense of, in terms of her tonality, what's really important to her and the point she's trying to make in it. But it really is two books in one. It's your personal history with your mother and your family, and then it's all the keen observations you made about the place, the physical place, the history that it runs through, which is why Dan Walters of Cal Matters said, we quote him frequently, the 10 isn't like other roadways. It's a monument to who we are in many respects. And he said that when it was closed down in LA when there was a fire there. And when you see it not occupied, suddenly the thing reveals itself for the first time, the scale of the infrastructure we build. So I want to end here, as you just pointed out, in Jacksonville and read something, because I think it's a great way to bring this conversation to closure. We're now on the 10, and you say, now we've gotten all the way to the eastern side, rather than a straight shot that spat me out at the far end, however, the 10 was more akin to an elevator I boarded and immediately pushed every button, each floor in a different view, a microcosm of the larger whole. The 10 showed me that this country can break your heart over and over, while at the same time there can be beauty so immense it makes you bigger somehow. I mean, that's a pretty poetic way to look at a piece of concrete infrastructure that people probably don't take notice of. When you got to the end, it didn't just end. It was a swirl. It is a swirl. I've done it. Again, elaborate a little bit more on concluding your trip and why that was maybe the way it should be, as opposed to coming to a very clean, this is the end of the I-10.
If there was one note that my editor gave me more than any other, and again and again and again, she really wanted me to hit this idea that, mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, parents and children, we are cycles that never completely end, right? We kind of, each generation bleeds into the next with our trauma, with our joys, with our experiences. And so this idea that, it's like a law of physics, right? Energy can neither be created or destroyed. It just is constantly changing into something else. And that was there in the built landscape. The 10 doesn't really end, and yet it exists, but it doesn't really begin. The 1 becomes the 10, and the 10 goes on to become something else. And this concept of, I was so aware that that there are readers who love a clean ending. They want the 10 to end, and they want the 10 to begin. And lives are a lot like highways in that one kind of flows into the next. There's a lovely line from one of my very favorite books, Cloud Atlas, which is, our lives are not our own. There is a degree to which we are, as ever and always, beholden to each other, not just to your parents or to your children, but to your community. And the idea that the 10 as this landscape goes through, as you pointed out, some of the darkest and most complicated landscape histories that America has to offer. And yet, we see what can come out of it. We can see that there is a dance party once a year, smack dab in the middle of the Rio Grande, where Mexicans and Americans, and you honestly cannot tell the difference between the two, dance to music, and the Border Patrol, looks the other way for one day. And it's the best food you've ever had, or that you can go to Frenchman Street in New Orleans that is just down the way from one of the biggest slave markets in the world. And you can hear a musical legacy that is born out of murder, rape, torture, chaos. And it begat such joy that it created the American Songbook that now exists on every playlist around the world. I think that the 10 for me and the trip that I took was such a reintroduction to, as you said, the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. And it made me so aware of the stakes of being American. And it made me so proud of what we are capable of and the true exceptionalism that we offer through a history of dispassionate facts that reveal just what we're capable of when we're cooking on all cylinders with gas. And that is that in community, Americans can build something like New Orleans, that shouldn't have even existed, and yet it still does. Or like your New Orleans, Houston, that is delicious and complicated and like a planet from Star Wars. It can never be completely mapped, and yet we know it like the back of our hands. And that, one of the best banh mi's in the world is in Houston. That we are a textbook of deliciousness and dreams that can never fully be captured. And yet, it is our responsibility to keep dreaming that dream. And I think the 10 for me as a road and as a political landscape is very much like my relationship with my mother, which is there were good days and there were bad days. And I'm so grateful for both because they make me who I am. And I think that America is experiencing a series of bad days. And if we have the fortitude and the courage and the wit to make good come from it, I think we'd be cooking with gas.
Well, that's a great way to conclude. And when you say dreaming that dream, I think that's codified by the fact that the cities along the 10, many of them are booming and they're growing. Their populations are increasing in spite of the fact, our knowledge that hurricanes strike this area frequently, major droughts happen in the West, and a variety of other things. That's a very American way to look at the landscape. Say, yeah, we can overcome that.
I see what you're saying, and yet...
Yeah.
No. That's the American approach.
Yes.
To facts.
Right. Yeah. No, watch this. I mean, that was the approach to moving to the West. We can overcome the difficulties, and sometimes we did some violent things in that process, but we imagined the possibility. And I think the 10 is filled with that, including all its dichotomies and contradictions, which is what attracted both of us unknowingly, independently to it. And I would just want to say in conclusion, you have greatly enriched our understanding of the 10. We both know it from direct experience, but you've added such another layer to it that we're really grateful for that. I'm sure this isn't the last conversation that we will have about it.
I hope it isn't.
And we'll probably do some more things together, but it demonstrates that geography matters. And keeping your eyes open, what you would call soft eyes, to what's happening around you can be greatly rewarding. And this conversation is a testament to that. So, Elizabeth, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. This was an absolute delight and a pleasure. And now I'm very hungry.
There you go. Okay, go get some lunch.
Something delicious.
There you go. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.